Have you ever imagined being accused of something you didn't do and not having anyone by your side to defend you? Now think, what if this happened to a child, an orphan girl, only 10 years old, poor, silent, invisible to everyone's eyes? A simple gesture, an innocent trip to a grocery store turns into a public nightmare. Screams, accusations, shame. She tries to explain, but no one wants to listen. After all, when someone has already been labeled by their appearance, who cares about the truth? The trial was quick, cruel, and in front of cold eyes she was convicted without evidence. How often does this happen out there, with people who just needed a little compassion? Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt that you were blamed just for the way you dress or where you come from? Then stay here, because this story will move your heart. Before continuing, enjoy the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any details. It was early, there was not even a proper sun yet, when the light steps of a 10-year-old girl cut through the silent sidewalks of the city. Her worn shoes made a muffled sound over the cold asphalt as she followed the same path as always, every day, without delay, without protest. It was as if it were part of the landscape. No one noticed her, neither the drivers who passed in a hurry, nor the pedestrians with their eyes fixed on their own problems. The girl walked with her shoulders hunched, her thin body hidden under clothes that were too big, faded, frayed from so much use and time. She lived in a municipal shelter that few knew about, and almost no one wanted to visit. Their simple, clean but impersonal place, where the noise of the other orphans mixed with the deep silence of longing that none of them knew how to explain. There were no pictures on the walls. There were no spontaneous hugs, just rules, schedules, and hurried glances from adults who always seemed too busy to ask her how she felt, and maybe she wouldn't even know how to answer if they asked. Every morning, I left the shelter with my school uniform and a backpack that was too light for someone who should be carrying books. Inside her, there was only a half-crumpled notebook, a half-finished pencil, and an eraser that she found on the floor weeks ago. Her brown hair, long and always loose, fell over her eyes and covered part of her face. It was an involuntary protection, almost a shield against the world. His look was that of someone who has seen too much even though he has never gone far. From those who heard screams that they shouldn't, felt absences that no one explained and learned. Too soon not to bother anyone. On the way to school, she passed by the same grocery store in the neighborhood every day. A small but busy place. People hurried in and out with bags in their hands, while the owner, a middle-aged man with a harsh expression, watched everything with suspicious eyes. Sometimes she stopped in front of the window, not for long, just long enough to see the colorful candies lined up in glass jars, the smell of fresh bread escaping through the half-open door. He never had the courage to enter. She never had money, and even if she did, something about her said that this place was not for her. It was as if there was an invisible sign saying, "Forbidden to dream." At school, his presence was not much different. He always sat at the back of the room, near the window, not by choice, but because no one wanted to sit next to her. Some colleagues whispered, others ignored her completely. When the snack was served, she ate slowly as if she wanted to make the little she had last. On days when the shelter couldn't provide lunch, she just pretended she wasn't hungry. And even so, he never complained. I never asked. His voice was almost a whisper, used only when absolutely necessary. During recess, she used to sit under a tree in the courtyard, hugging her knees, looking at the ground. He didn't play, he didn't run, he didn't laugh. I just watched. It was as if he was expecting something that he didn't even know how to define. Maybe a gesture, a kind look, any question. But that never came. She was like the wind that passes unnoticed, always there, but never seen. In the afternoon, the way back was the same. Sidewalks, corners, cars, noise, silence. He passed by the same grocery store and went to the shelter. I repeated everything the next day, and the next, and the next. The routine was as fixed as the loneliness that accompanied it. Sometimes the girl imagined what it would be like to have someone waiting for her at the gate, with a smile and a tight hug. I imagined what it would be like to have a name shouted fondly at dinner time. But all this lived only in the imagination, and over time, even then, it seemed to be disappearing. She was just another child forgotten by the world, and at the same time, he carried within him a silent strength, a fragile hope that insisted on resisting, even with everything pushing down. As much as she seemed invisible to the eyes of others, something inside her still believed that one day someone would really see her. That was the girl's world, a world of absences, silences, and small unfulfilled dreams. But soon something would break this routine, something unexpected, something that would start as another pain, but it would end up revealing much more than anyone could imagine. If this story has touched your heart so far, enjoy the video and subscribe to the channel, and tell us, which city are you watching from? That morning, everything looked exactly the same cloudy sky that covered the city with grey tones, the same smell of bread that escaped through the doors of the shops still opening, the same silent footsteps of the girl walking along sidewalks already decorated by custom. The shelter had served a piece of bread with margarine and a glass of thin milk, and that was enough to keep the stomach from hurting until noon. She went out in the same clothes as the day before because she was the only clean one, and with the same mute hope as always that no one would notice her, and that the day would pass without loneliness hurting so much. On the way, he passed the grocery store again. The movement was still timid, and the owner, as usual, was behind the counter with his eyes half closed, watching the small world around him as if watching more than selling. For the first time, perhaps on impulse, perhaps out of fatigue from just watching from a distance, the girl entered. She went slowly, with short steps, almost asking permission with her own body. He said nothing. He just crossed the door and looked. He smelled the sweet smell coming from the shelves, saw the colorful packages of cookies, the buckets with assorted candies, the chocolate exposed a few inches from his hands. She approached, hesitantly, without extending her fingers. I just watched. The texture of the packaging reflected a soft glow under artificial light. It was one of those chocolates with a creamy filling that she had heard other children comment on at school. I had never tasted it, never even insured one. Time seemed to stand still there, between the contained desire and the constant fear of being seen. But the silence was broken by a dry noise. One of the chocolates slipped off the edge of the shelf and fell to the floor, as if he wanted to free himself with her from that moment. The sound echoed louder than it should have. The grocer turned quickly. The eyes, which were already naturally suspicious, narrowed in anger. His body came towards the girl like an avalanche. Before any words could be spoken, the trial began. The man pointed to the ground, then to her, and the accusation came like thunder. Thief! She screamed loud enough that the few customers who were in the store stopped what they were doing and looked at her in amazement. No one questioned it. No one asked what had happened. The girl, frightened, tried to babble something, his eyes filled with tears before the words even came out. She tried to explain herself, tried to show that nothing was in her hands, tried to say that the chocolate fell on its own, but he didn't listen. His face was red, his voice getting louder and louder. The word thief was repeated like a cruel sentence. That small figure, with his face wet with tears and his arms glued to his body, became a target of accusing looks. And in that instant, no look seemed heavier than that of the woman holding a shopping bag and shaking her head with contempt, without knowing the story, without knowing the name, without caring. The owner of the store did not stop. He shouted angrily, threatened to call the police. A man who was next to the cashier suggested that he let it go, it was just a child, but he refused to listen. I wanted an example. I wanted to show that no one there touched things without paying. And that day, for him, that girl seemed the perfect target. She was small, fragile, defenseless, and no one was there for her, no one who said, "Calm down, let's listen to what she has to say." With each second, the scene seemed to get worse. The owner approached, took the girl by the arm and pushed her towards the door. The touch was too strong for her body, which tripped and almost fell. Her wide eyes mixed pain and disbelief. It was as if the world, which was already heavy, had decided to crush her for good. The street swallowed her back, and the door of the grocery store closed with a bang behind her. Inside, people went back to their shopping. Outside, the girl remained still for a few seconds without reaction. His face was covered with shame, a kind of shame that is not shouted at, that is not understood. The shame of not knowing what he did wrong, the shame of being looked at as something dirty, dangerous, unwanted. She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her blouse, took a deep breath and started walking. Her body trembled, not only with fear but with something even worse, the feeling that this was just another part of life, that no one would come to his defense, that being treated like this was perhaps normal. On the way back to the shelter, the silence was heavier than usual. The voices of the other children, the footsteps in the corridors, everything seemed distant, muffled. She didn't tell anyone, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew it wouldn't make a difference. How many times had she been ignored? How many times had he tried to speak and no one listened? It was like screaming in the water. No one listens, no one answers. She lay down on the thin bed and, facing the wall, let the tears come by themselves, without sound, without protest. The next morning he took the same route, the same steps, the same sidewalk, the same uniform. But something was different. She walked with her shoulders even more shrugged, her gaze even lowered. He didn't look at the grocery store as he passed. Shame still lived in her, along with the fear that everything would be repeated or worse, that someone else would recognize her as the thief girl. That title hurt more than any lack of food, more than any torn garment. At school, classmates seemed even more distant. They didn't know what had happened, but it seemed that she herself carried the guilt stamped on her body. In the afternoon again, the grocery store in sight. Again, the averting of the gaze. Now she walked faster, like someone fleeing from a haunted place. And inside he carried a weight that no one saw, the weight of injustice. The kind of pain that doesn't show up in wounds, but that marks deeply. But what she didn't know, it's just that even in the face of all this, even in the face of humiliation and abandonment, something was about to happen, something that would completely change the course of this story. The street was more crowded than usual that morning. It was Friday, the eve of payment, and the residents of the neighborhood circulated between bags, queues, and haste. The girl came with even smaller steps than usual. The memory of the previous day still throbbed like an open wound, exposed to the world without a bandage. His gaze avoided everything. Shop windows, people, windows, even the very floor seemed like a dangerous place to look at. But there was something in her feet that betrayed her. As if carried away by habit, they crossed the entrance of the grocery store again. Perhaps it was the unconscious search for redemption. Perhaps just the automatic movement of those who have no other destination to go. The owner, who until then had arranged a shelf of canned goods, saw her approaching. Blood seemed to rise to his face once more. The anger there was no longer about chocolate, nor about mistrust. It was about control, about proving a point, about showing who's boss. He dropped what he was doing and advanced towards the girl with firm steps and impatience in his eyes. Before she could even get out, she was grabbed by the arm with force disproportionate to the fragile size of her body. The man shouted, drawing the attention of everyone present. The accusation was thrown again, like a stone thrown without aiming. The harsh words echoed through the store, tearing through the air like razors. Customers stopped their purchases. A lady with bags in her hands stopped, frowned, but said nothing. A teenager leaning against a beverage freezer pulled out his cell phone, perhaps thinking of recording, but soon gave up. Others just watched, as if it were part of some inconvenient spectacle. The girl, paralyzed, tried to keep her eyes open. The tears were already there, but she forced herself to hold them back. He knew that if he cried, even more contempt would come. Even more pointing fingers, poisonous whispers, muffled laughter. When the owner opened the door and pushed it hard out, the impact of the gesture was greater than the physical one. Her body staggered, her knees almost gave way, but she remained standing as if learning to fall without making a sound. The eyes of passers-by registered the scene like a flash, a thin girl with cheap clothes being treated like discarded garbage. Some looked away. Others frowned for a second as if something was wrong, but not enough to warrant intervention. A woman on the sidewalk crossed to the other side in a hurry. A man in a delivery uniform looked, shook his head, and went on. His way. It was then that the grocer decided to call the police. He took out his cell phone, made the call with loud gestures, as if he wanted everyone to hear. It didn't take long for a car to pull over. 2 police officers came down with a protocol, posture without haste, without surprise. One of them approached, assessing the scene quickly. A dirty, crying child, surrounded by fluctuating stares and accusations. The merchant spoke loudly, waved his hands, asked for action. The girl, on the other hand, just stood there, motionless. Her face red, her voice stuck in her throat. There was no one for her. No outstretched hands, no sincere questions, just silences, full of judgment. The older policeman walked around her as if analyzing a strange piece out of place. He said something to his partner, and the two looked at each other with a bored expression. The owner of the store, impatient, wanted action, wanted punishment, wanted that threat to be taken away. But the policeman only sighed. He looked at the girl again and, with coldness in tone, told her to get out of there and not come back. He didn't ask for her name, he didn't ask for a document, he didn't care what she had to say. I just wanted to get it over with. The merchant tried to protest, but the police officer did not get involved anymore. He climbed back into the car and the car drove away. The girl stood there, standing in the middle of the sidewalk, exposed to the world as if she were guilty of something she could not even explain. The tears, once contained, now flowed without. Resistance. She was alone, really, more than ever. The look was no longer just sad, it was hurt. The shame she felt was not only for herself, but for knowing that no adult in that space had been able to defend her, that no one around him saw a child there. For all intents and purposes, it was just a problem to be taken out of the way. Some people laughed, out of the corner of his mouth with derision, a short, poisonous laugh which carried in itself the cowardice of those who feel greater when they see someone even smaller. Others whispered, mean comments, wrong deductions, phrases. Like it's always like this, then they want to play the victim. The girl heard everything, each syllable cut like a blade. She didn't understand how the world could be so harsh even when you're so small. Still trembling, he began to walk. The quick steps, the face lowered, the arms glued to the body. I felt people looking, commenting, condemning. He wanted to run, but his legs seemed too heavy. The shelter seemed miles away, but she continued. Because that's all he knew how to do. Keep going, even when everything hurt. When he arrived, he entered without saying anything. He went straight up to the bedroom and crawled under the thin covers, even with the sun high outside. The light came through the window and hit the worn mattress. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe, but the scene repeated itself in his mind like a nightmare in a loop. The pushing, the screams, the looks, the absence of someone around. That feeling of being at the mercy of the world, without protection, without voice. He tried to imagine if it would ever be just a distant memory, but at that moment that was all there was. And yet, even with all the pain that enveloped her, something much bigger than herself was moving around, something she couldn't see, but that somehow began to prepare to turn the tide. That night, the sky seemed to reflect exactly what she felt, heavy, opaque, without stars. The dim light from the street came through the shelter's windows, drawing soft shadows on the floor of the collective room where dozens of children shared space but not stories. She curled up in her bed, her face turned to the wall, trying to hide from the world and especially from her own thoughts. The voices of the other girls mingled with the distant noises of the city that did not sleep. But everything sounded distant, muffled, as if she were submerged. He said nothing. Not to the caregiver, not to her roommates, not to herself. He kept everything in silence, as someone who has already learned that words, when they are not heard, become just another weight to carry. He didn't cry loudly. He didn't complain. He didn't scream. The cry that came was silent, hidden in the rough pillow, absorbed by a cloth that had already seen more tears than dreams. The pain wasn't just from the humiliation. It was from the realization that once again there was no one. No one to ask what happened. No one to look you in the eye and say, "I believe in you." It was as if the whole world had agreed to forget his existence, to treat it as a mistake, a leftover, something that is tolerated but never truly accepted. And worst of all, I felt like I was starting to believe that too, beginning to accept that there was no room for her in the beautiful places of life. What affection was luxury? That justice was a privilege. That dignity was something for others. The next morning, everything was repeated. The shelter's alarm clock rang. The children stood up in a row, and she followed the flow with the same expression she used to protect herself. The uniform, still damp from the day before, stuck to his body. The coffee was the usual, warm, thin, silent. No one asked why she barely touched the cup. No one noticed that she didn't utter a single word until she left for school. And perhaps that was the worst kind of loneliness, the one that really feels surrounded by people. On the way, the steps were slower. The body seemed lighter, but only because the soul was heavier. She didn't look at the grocery store. In fact, he crossed to the other side of the street before he even reached the corner. Fear had stuck to her like a second skin. The fear of seeing that man again. The fear of hearing the words echoing. The fear of being put against the wall again without even having a chance to explain. But more than that, there was a deeper, crueler fear. The fear of continuing to be invisible, because there was something inside her that screamed, even if no one heard. Something that said she didn't just want to survive, she wanted to be seen. I wanted to be called by name. I wanted someone to notice when I was sad. I wanted to know what it was like to feel safe. From a very young age, she learned to be silent when she felt pain. He learned that crying bothers him, that questions irritate him, that too much affection can be confused with neediness. Then she was silent. It was shaped to fit in a small space, because it was the only place they offered it. At school, the day was dragged on. His eyes were fixed on the board, but his mind wandered in distant places. When the teacher asked something, she didn't even notice. He felt the looks of his colleagues turning, some laughing, others just curious, but no one approached at recess. No one shared the snack. She sat on the same bench as always, hugging her own knees, looking at the floor, pretending not to hear the screams of the games that were happening a few meters away. And it is curious how silence, when it comes from a child, can be louder than any scream. But no one seemed to notice. It was as if his presence was a noise that the world had learned to ignore. And over time, even she began to think that maybe this was what she deserved. She began to accept that perhaps there was no place where she could be welcomed without judgment. He began to swallow the idea that his existence was too small to bother anyone. In the afternoon, back at the shelter, the same ritual. He arrived, entered, climbed the stairs. She changed her clothes slowly, as if trying to delay the inevitable. He went to bed earlier than usual, feigning sleep, just so he wouldn't have to speak. But he didn't sleep. He stood there, eyes open, staring at the damp-stained ceiling. The noises from the building seemed louder that night. The creaking of the doors, the footsteps in the hallway, the dripping of the tap. Everything was sound, everything was loneliness. And it was in this void that she began, silently, to lose herself. When you have no support, no voice, no name, you begin to believe that you are nobody. And that was exactly what hurt, realizing that he was slowly giving up on himself. There was no rebellion, there was no revolt, just a deep silence like that of someone who screams inside and no longer believes that anyone will listen. But there was still a part of her, even if very small, that resisted. An almost extinguished spark that said it could not end there, that it wasn't fair, that something was too wrong to be normal. And maybe it was this spark, this little bit of almost invisible hope, that would keep everything standing, until the truth finally came out. At the grocery store, the days followed their almost automatic rhythm. The coming and going of customers continued, the shelves were restocked every morning, and the owner kept the same watchful eye as always, as if everything around was a threat, disguised as routine. But there was something, albeit small, that began to bother her, a subtle, almost imperceptible detail that insisted on escaping the hands of the rigid control he liked to exert so much, the amount of sweets that disappeared. That cramped establishment, each product had its place, each item was counted. He knew well how many chocolates he had left in the display on the eve of the confusion. He was sure that, after expelling the girl with so much fanfare, the problem was solved. Her presence was the perfect and comfortable explanation for any deviation. A girl alone, poor, silent. It was easy to paint that fragile face with the paint of guilt. It is even easier to erase this figure from everyday life, as if it had never existed. But the numbers didn't lie. The candy jars were less full. The chocolate bars had shrunk again, and no one seemed to have bought it. The cashier did not show compatible sales. No customer paid for those absences, and even if he tried to rationalize, there was a growing restlessness, a shadow of doubt that appeared when I looked at the shelf and realized that something disappeared without explanation. Deep down, he knew that this was no coincidence, but to accept another truth would be to admit that you were wrong, and that, for him, was unthinkable. In the days following the girl's expulsion, the subject slowly died on the lips of the neighbors. Most did not even remember what happened. Others just commented between coffees, always with a tone of judgment in disguise. After all, no one accuses for nothing. That was the phrase he heard the most, and repeated to himself, as if trying to convince himself. The girl's silence made it even easier to maintain the narrative. There were no parents to complain about. There were no protests, no witnesses. For all intents and purposes, the grocer just did what needed to be done. But when he was alone, with the store empty and the sound of the street filtered through the window bars, that memory came back, the girl's gaze. It was not the look of someone who was caught red-handed. It was that of someone who was forcibly torn from a place where he should never have been treated like this. A frightened, wounded look that he tried to erase from his memory, but which now appeared between the shelves like a silent ghost of his own consciousness. Time passed and the stock kept dwindling, without justification, no plausible explanation. He even went so far as to overhaul the sales system, to recount the items, to discreetly observe some younger customers. But nothing, and as much as he didn't want to admit it, the doubt now began to grow like a crack in the wall. Had he made a mistake? It was easier to believe that it was not. It was more comfortable to maintain the image of authority, of someone who protects his own business, of someone who does not allow himself to be deceived. Reviewing that situation would mean giving up pride, the discourse he built in front of others, the false certainty that made him sleep in peace. Because it wasn't just about the chocolate. It was about what was done to a defenseless child, about the way she was pushed, about the screams, about the humiliation. It was about the weight that was placed on the shoulders of someone so small, just to relieve the feeling of helplessness in the face of other problems. But now, with each package missing from the counter, pride began to lose ground to restlessness. He found himself more often looking at the security camera installed at the top of the wall, as if it had something to say, as if it could free him from the doubt or, who knows, confirm it. The device was always there, but it was rarely consulted. It served more as a visual warning than as an actual surveillance tool, and yet now he seemed to have become a silent judge. Each night, when he closed the store, he walked slower through the narrow aisles. His eyes scanned the shelves as if looking for traces of something that insists on escaping. There was a growing discomfort, but he struggled with it. He said to himself that he didn't have time to review recordings, that it was an exaggeration, that the girl was indeed responsible. Because if she wasn't, so what would he have done? The mind rationalized, but the heart knew. I knew something was wrong. He knew that her absence brought no relief, but an uncomfortable emptiness. That after that violent expulsion, something changed in the air of the store. The clientele seemed slightly different. Some entered, looked, and left without buying. Women from the neighborhood who used to frequent the place every week now passed right by and avoided the merchant's gaze. He noticed, but pretended not to notice, because the truth bothers you, and we often prefer the silence of illusion to the noise of consciousness. Even so, the feeling that he had made a mistake grew slowly, like a drop that drips endlessly into an empty bucket, until the sound becomes unbearable. He wondered, in silence, if that girl would really have the courage to steal, if that tear running down his face was theater, if that scared look was just fear of being caught, or if it was fear of being wronged like so many other times. And scariest of all, What if no one had ever believed her before? Doubt began to seep into the cracks of the mind. She didn't scream. She didn't demand immediate answers. But it was there, and he wasn't going to leave. It was silent between one customer and another, in the reflection of the shop window, in the chocolate that disappeared, and above all, it was recorded somewhere in the store's system, waiting to be seen. And it was at this point, when the restlessness became greater than the comfort of ignorance, that something inside him began to give way. Not out of true repentance yet, but for fear of what I might find, for fear of having thrown a huge weight on the back of someone who deep down just wanted to exist in peace. Time passed, but the discomfort remained. It was like a fine dust that, even after several attempts to sweep it away, insisted on remaining in the corners of consciousness. The grocer tried to ignore it, tried to keep his usual firm posture, but there was something in his gestures that betrayed him. The hesitation before checking the stock, the look that escaped from the camera installed at the top of the wall, the way he avoided any mention of the girl among the neighbors. Everything indicated that something inside him was no longer as before. The certainty that once sustained him was crumbling, and he knew it. It was on an ordinary day, an afternoon when the strong sun was beating straight down on the windows, and the fans seemed useless against the sultry heat, that the unexpected happened. A frequent customer had complained about a wrong amount on the bill. Nothing serious, but enough to get you to sift through records. The computer was on, the system files were open, and there, between one tab and another, he decided, on impulse or necessity, to open the camera images. It was not his original intention. The investigation was different. But all it took was one click, a video file dated a few days ago, for everything to change. The recording began like so many others. The routine movement of the store, people coming and going, bags being lifted, goods being stacked on the shelves. Everything common, everything ordinary. Until, at a specific point, the image stopped being just another one. A group of boys enters. Clean clothes, backpacks on their backs, loose laughter. One of them, taller, more confident, looks around with the calm of someone who already knows the place well. While the others talk next to the cashier, he approaches the shelf of sweets. The gestures are fast, precise. A chocolate bar goes into the backpack, then another. He doesn't hesitate, he doesn't worry about disguising too much. He just smiles, turns to his friends, and walks normally, like someone who has just bought a soft drink. The video was clear. The image is clear. The boy's face visible. There was no room for doubt. And there, standing in front of the screen, the grocer felt his stomach churn. He was the son of one of his best clients. A well-known man in the neighborhood, respected, always well-dressed, who insisted on being called by his last name. The boy, smiling in the recording, was the same one who had recently been there with his father, making jokes and picking up candies from the counter without paying. He remembered. The hand that held the mouse began to shake slightly. Breathing changed. It wasn't just the shock of the image. That was all it meant. Because suddenly the castle of certainties he built collapsed on him. The girl, the accusation, the screams, the push, the presence of the police. Everything came back with violence, as if it were happening again, only now with a new weight. The confirmation that I had made a mistake. And not just wrong, it had been cruel, with someone who had no way to defend himself. He tried to mentally justify, he tried to rationalize. Maybe the boy was just playing, maybe it was the first time. But these excuses died before they even took shape. Because no matter how many times it had happened, the fact was that on that day he chose the wrong victim. And he chose in the worst way. With eyes loaded with prejudice. With a hasty judgment based not on facts but on appearance, status, social context. The feeling that came after was mixed. A hot, heavy guilt that spread through the body like fever. And an even more paralyzing fear. The fear that other people would see the video, that they knew what he had done, that they could see clearly the error that he could no longer hide. But there was also something different this time, a deeper restlessness which did not concern only reputation but conscience. To what is done when there is no more excuse, when the truth is there, stamped on the screen, looking back at you. He kept watching. He reviewed the excerpt, paused, He zoomed in. There was no doubt. It was that boy, the same one who greeted him with a pat on the back, the same one who got extra gum without paying, the same one who, at some point, gained his trust just by belonging to a certain type of people. And the contrast with the image of the girl, small, silent, pushed out as if it were a disposable object, now appeared as a stain that he could not erase. The silence of the store, at that moment, seemed deafening. The sound of the fans spinning on the ceiling was the only noise, and even that seemed far away. He rose from his chair with a strange weight on his shoulders. She walked to the candy rack, looked at the empty spaces, and tried to remember if she had seen the boy there in the last few days. She realized that yes, that he came often, that he took things without paying, that he did it with the naturalness of someone who knows he will not be reprimanded. And then he understood. That girl was not only wronged, it was used as a shield. It was the easiest target for a problem he didn't have the courage to face. In the following days, the image of the video did not leave his head. With each customer who entered, with each child who passed through the door, he found himself mentally reviewing the seconds of the recording. The weight of guilt began to erode his pride, to shake his certainties. He tried to keep working as if nothing had happened, but the girl's face appeared in every corner of the store. On the shelf where she had stopped, at the door where she was pushed, on the ground where he almost fell. That scene, which he believed he had forgotten, now came back with details that he had not even noticed before. The expression in her eyes, the way he held back his tears, the way he left, trying to maintain some dignity even in the midst of humiliation. And perhaps what disturbed him the most was to realize that at no time had she screamed. He didn't stamp his feet. He didn't make a scandal. He just tried to defend himself, with words too weak to break through the walls of prejudice around him. She trusted, even if only for a moment, that she could be heard. And he chose the opposite. Now, with the truth stamped in front of him, there remained the question that was beginning to form, timid and uncomfortable. What to do with it? How to deal with a revelation that, no matter how silent, screamed for justice in some way? Because as much as I wanted to delete that video, there was no way to erase what it revealed, and as much as he tried to ignore it, there was something inside him that no longer allowed him to continue as before. That morning, the merchant arrived earlier than usual. He unlocked the door with unusual care, as if he feared waking ghosts that only he could see. The grocery store was empty, quiet, just the way I used to like it. But now, that silence bothered him. He sat behind the counter, his eyes fixed on the computer, the video still open, paused exactly at the moment when the boy was hiding the chocolate in his backpack. His smile, frozen on the screen, seemed to mock. Not only of justice, but of the illusion that he himself has nurtured for so long. As the fan spun slowly on the ceiling, every second of that recording repeated itself inside his head with the precision of a clock. The girl's face came back with it, not just in the moment she was pushed out of the store, but in all the details he had ignored. The teary eyes, the mouth trembling as she tried to explain, the shoulders hunched by the shame of being called a thief without ever having been heard. And now, with the truth stamped before him, there was no escape. For the first time, the man felt something that wasn't just discomfort or doubt. It was regret, pure, heavy, painful, a kind of pain that is not resolved with quick excuses, nor is it dissolved with silence. He had made a mistake too big to be swept under the rug, and worst of all, he knew there was no turning back. There was no way to erase what was said, how to undo what was done. He spent the whole day in a state of restlessness. He attended to customers automatically, but barely listened to what they said. The head was flying. Everything seemed out of place. The grocery store, which had once been his realm of control and certainty, now seemed like a fragile set built on walls of prejudice and haste. In the afternoon, he looked out the window and saw children leaving school. Some went straight through, others entered neighboring businesses. None looked at him. And in the middle of that group, there was not the girl. The feeling of urgency began to form. I needed to do something. He needed to look for her, to understand where she lived, where she studied, who she lived with, her name, which he hadn't, even asked on the day of the accusation, now became the only thing that mattered. He left the store at the end of the day, left the counter with the lights on, and walked through the streets of the neighborhood with a weight on his chest that prevented him from speeding up his steps. He stopped in front of the school. He waited a few minutes. The lights were off, the gates closed. He asked a lady who was cleaning the sidewalk if she knew the girl. Small, brown-haired, quiet, orphaned. The woman thought for a while, seemed to recognize her but could not tell where she lived. He indicated a city hall shelter a few blocks away. He thanked him, moved on. In front of the gate of the shelter, he felt his hands sweat. He rang the bell, waited. An employee answered, and he hesitantly asked for the girl. The answer came dry. "She's fine, but she doesn't want to talk to anyone." The tone was defensive, as if they already knew who he was. And in fact, they knew. Because the story was no longer just his. Someone had seen the recording. Maybe an employee, maybe a neighbor who knew the two boys. The video had been shared. And as with everything that carries raw truth and evident injustice, it has spread. In a few hours, it was circulating through the neighborhood's networks. Message groups, local profiles, outraged mothers, angry teachers. Everyone saw the face of the well-dressed boy putting the chocolate in his backpack. And everyone remembered the girl being humiliated on the sidewalk. The news gained strength, not only because of the mistake made, but because of the symbology of the case. The invisible girl who was accused without evidence, pushed, silenced, and the protected boy laughing, hiding what did not belong to him. The contrast was too sharp to ignore, and people felt it. A quiet revolt began to form. There were no shouts, no protests in the streets, but there were different looks, comments. In the queues, implied judgments, customers who entered and did not greet. The merchant noticed everything. The next day, half of the usual clientele did not show up. Those who entered spoke softly, avoided the subject, but the silence was more eloquent than any direct accusation. And deep down, he knew that was his sentence. He spent the night awake, thinking, reviewing every gesture, every word said. He could not understand how he had let himself be carried away by so much certainty. How could he look at a child with such contempt? How he was able to expel her with violence, without even giving her a chance to explain herself. Now these questions haunted him. He tried to write a letter. Then he thought about recording a video apologizing. No option seemed sufficient. Nothing seemed to be able to give back to the girl what he had taken away. The trust in the world, the feeling that she could be heard, the dignity that was crushed in front of so many complicit eyes. He went to the shelter again. He took candy. He took toys. He took what he could think of as a form of repair. But he was barred. The director of the place thanked him, but refused him entry. He said that the girl needed time. She said that despite being small, she understood everything, and that she wasn't ready to see him yet. He came back with his head down. I knew that sometimes forgiveness does not come at the time you want. Sometimes he doesn't even come. And even if one day it comes, there is damage that will not be erased. There are scars that remain to remember what was done. But he knew he couldn't just go back to the store and pretend nothing happened. Because now it wasn't just about him. It was about what his attitude represented. It was about what the community was beginning to realize. About the many others who, like her, were silenced with no chance of defense. And even though he didn't know what to do with all that guilt, he felt, for the first time in a long time, that he needed to do more than repent. I needed to start changing, even if it was late, even if forgiveness took time, even if it never came. Because from then on, something inside him was no longer the same, and the whole neighborhood seemed to feel it too. During the following days, the story took shape outside the four walls of the grocery store. It was no longer just a street corner rumor, nor a video circulating silently in neighborhood groups. It gained reach, gained body, gained name. Injustice, which had previously been buried under indifference, now went hand in hand with collective indignation. Local journalists began to look for details, to understand who the girl was, what had happened to her after that day, why no one had done anything. The video of the boy hiding the chocolate had become irrefutable proof that the accusation had been hasty, cruel, unfair. The recording, just over a minute long, went viral, but not for its scandalous content, but for the pain it conveyed between the lines. The figure of the girl, previously invisible, now occupied the center of a commotion that grew with each new sharing, and this time she wasn't alone. At the shelter, the impact was immediate. The coordinator of the place, upon seeing the video, felt a pang of revolt and an urgency that she had not felt for a long time. He gathered the team, notified the competent bodies, and without delay the situation was taken to the children's police station. But now, the treatment was different. The girl was not called to give explanations. She was invited to tell her story. For the first time, someone listened to her unhurriedly, with attentive eyes, with open ears, with respect. A public defender was assigned to the case. In a few hours, a child psychologist was called to accompany her. On her face there was still distrust. The silence, which for so long had been a shield, was still present. But something had changed in the air. When asked his name, the tone was not one of demand. It was welcoming, and that, as small as it seemed, was like lighting a small candle. In a dark room long ago, while the bureaucracy ran behind the scenes, the community began to move organically. A chain of solidarity has formed on social networks. People who knew nothing about her came to know. A teacher in the neighborhood wrote a moving text about invisible children. One mother shared the video with the caption, "It could be my daughter." A local NGO created a fundraising campaign in support of the shelter where she lived. Within hours, food, clothes, toys, books, and, most importantly, attention arrived. At the police station, the unusual movement of journalists, guardianship, counselors and social workers drew attention. Reporters were looking for details of the story. They wanted to understand how this girl had gone unnoticed for so long. The questions were many, and the answers hurt. Because the truth was simple and uncomfortable, no one had paid attention to it before. The coordinator of the shelter, emotional, told reporters what the girl's daily life was like. He spoke of her reserved behavior, the silent routine, the way she hid from the world, and he said with teary eyes that it would never happen again, that she wouldn't be invisible again, that now everyone knew his name, everyone knew his face, and everyone was watching. When the psychologist asked her what she wanted to do from then on, the girl did not answer immediately. But hours later, holding a new notebook with colored pencils in her hands and a juice on the table, she drew something. It was simple. A sun, a house, a tree, a girl in a yellow dress, and in the corner of the page, a smile. Small, shy, almost imperceptible. But a smile, and that detail was like a flag raised after the storm. The messages of support kept coming, handwritten letters, colorful cards with drawings of children from other schools. A local bakery offered to provide snacks to the shelter for a month. A children's clothing store delivered new pieces to all the girls in the house. And through it all, she began to feel for the first time that the world could be a little less hostile. That there was a place, even if small, where it fit. Visits to the psychologist's office have become frequent. Silence was little by little giving way to words. Not many, but enough to tell how she felt when she was pushed, how she was afraid to go back to school, how she thought no one would believe her. The professional listened to everything patiently. He did not interrupt, he did not judge, he just listened, and that was enough. At the shelter, the caregivers began to observe her more closely, not with pity but with care. And this care was not only hers, it was the other children's too. Some, once distant, now approached. They shared toys, sat next to her to draw. There was a different atmosphere in the air, as if everyone had learned something profound without anyone having to say a word. The merchant, in turn, remained silent. He avoided the cameras, the comments, the judgments, but I continued to follow everything. He saw the reports, read the headlines, listened to the interviews on the radio. He learned about the movement around the girl. And every time I heard his name mentioned with respect, I felt the weight of my own mistake increase. It was no longer just a commercial mistake, a misunderstanding. It was something bigger. A cut that did not heal easily. Still, he kept trying to find ways to make amends. He even wrote a formal letter of retraction delivered through the shelter. He received no response, and maybe he wouldn't even receive it. But deep down, he understood. I realize that there are pains that cannot be erased with words. There are marks that do not disappear, but there was something he could do. Change. And he started. He hired a young woman to work at the store, a former resident of the shelter. He started to donate a fixed amount monthly to the institution, and, discreetly, he put aside the prejudices that once shaped his attitudes. In the city, the girl's story became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of overcoming. A vivid reminder that even the deepest silence can find an echo when someone decides to listen. And though she was still reserved, something in her way had changed. The gaze, previously always lowered, now met the eyes of others, still shy, but firm. And that simple gesture said more than any speech. She had not forgotten what she had been through. But she began, little by little, to understand that she was not guilty, which never was. And even without knowing what would come next, for the first time in a long time he carried something new in his chest. It was not anger, nor fear, nor pain. It was hope, a small but powerful feeling, and everything indicated that even with scars, she was ready for what would come next. As the weeks passed, what seemed to have been just another isolated case of injustice gained much greater contours. The girl's story was no longer hers alone. It had become a mirror for the entire city, an uncomfortable reflection of behaviors that have always been there in plain sight, but that had never really been questioned. Ordinary people, who until then had only watched life go by in a hurry and indifference, began to look at their attitudes with another kind of attention. The conversations on the streets changed their tone. The silent tragedy of that child gave voice to many other forgotten stories, and meanwhile the gazes that had previously crossed the girl without seeing her now stopped. There was respect, care, even guilt. The silence that enveloped her was replaced by a new kind of presence, the presence of one who finally recognizes the humanity of the other. At school, where she used to occupy the back of the room as if trying to disappear, things began to change. The coordinator, visibly affected by the events, gathered the teachers for a deep and necessary conversation. They debated empathy, about the risk of ignoring the signs, about what it means to really include. An internal program was created to care for students in vulnerable situations. Teachers began to observe more than just report cards and assignments. They began to pay attention to silences, absences, and downcast looks. And for the first time, the school assumed its responsibility beyond the pedagogical content. The girl, little by little, integrated. She was not yet the most talkative in the room, nor had she suddenly become popular. But there was something different. Colleagues who had previously ignored her now sat next to her. They shared books, shy smiles, homework messages. It was a start. Small, but meaningful. Meanwhile, the merchant who had earlier pushed the child out of his store decided he could no longer hide. The weight of the mistake, which was already unbearable, had become a responsibility that he had to carry with dignity. He looked for a local channel and agreed to give an interview. Not to clean up his image, but to assume, with clarity, the dimension of what he had done. Facing the cameras with a choked voice, he acknowledged that he judged hastily. He admitted that he acted based on prejudices and that he failed as a human being. He apologized not only to the girl, but to all the children who have been treated as a problem just because they were poor orphans or different. The words did not erase what happened, but they were a step towards what is rarer, true repentance. The community watched, and the repercussion was intense. There were those who praised the courage to admit the mistake. There were those who said that it was too late. But between criticism and support, a fact prevailed. No one could pretend not to see it anymore. The city, which so often closed itself within its own routine, had been crossed by a truth that was difficult to ignore. The boy who had committed the theft was easily identified. His school, more elite, tried to minimize what happened at first. But the public pressure was greater. The boy's parents were called to a meeting. Confronted with the video and the repercussion of the case, they tried to justify their son's behavior with flimsy arguments. It was a joke. He didn't know what he was doing. But the guardianship counselors were firm. They explained that it was not about chocolate, but about responsibility. That impunity, when it starts early, teaches dangerous lessons. The boy started to attend a socio-educational program where he participated in conversation circles with other children about empathy, consequence, and choice. For the first time, perhaps, he heard stories of lives very different from his own. And in silence, he began to realize that laughing while someone is humiliated can leave marks that time does not erase. His parents, in turn, also faced the discomfort of a city that no longer accepted ready-made excuses. They were approached by neighbors, confronted at parents' meetings, criticized on social networks. But more than that, they were forced to face something that many avoid, the failure to teach values. And even reluctantly, they began a process of transformation. The central square, which was previously just a crossing point, received a new sign: Space of Respect. It was a symbolic but meaningful tribute. There, volunteers began to organize events to discuss inclusion, active listening, and the fight against prejudice. And on the cardboard murals that the children helped to assemble, there were phrases written in crooked letters, but giant truths. Every child deserves to be heard. No one is too small to have dignity. Do not judge without knowing. In the midst of all this, the girl continued her life, still in the shelter but with a completely different environment around her. The caregivers, now more sensitive, gave individual attention to each story. There were new activities, art workshops, conversation circles. The girl, who had previously been silent in the face of any question, now made small comments. I laughed discreetly when I saw the other children dance. He began to write. One of the volunteers brought a new diary, with a blue hardcover with smooth sheets. He said she could use it for whatever she wanted. In the following days, she started writing before bed. No one knew exactly what was being recorded there, but just the fact that she allowed herself to tell her own words was, in itself, an everyday miracle. The city had changed, and at the same time it remained the same. The sidewalks were still full, the buses were delayed, the newspapers reported old problems. But there was, among the people, a new consciousness, as if that girl had made everyone see further. As if, through her pain, each one had learned something about themselves, and this learning, silent and profound, still reverberated through the streets. Because, as much as the days went by again with the usual haste, no one could pass by the grocery store without remembering what happened there. No one looked at children in uniform with the same indifference as before. No one heard a silent cry without wondering, has anyone ever asked if she is okay? The girl's name was known, but more than that, the message she left unwittingly, and unspoken, was clear. The city learned, not with posters, nor speeches, nor threats. He learned from the raw truth of a look that one day begged to be seen. And it was. There was still a lot to be done. But for the first time, everyone knew that it was no longer possible to pretend they didn't know. She just wanted to be seen, and now the whole world has seen it. If this story touched you in any way, if you felt that each word carried something true, leave here in the comments the phrase, "This message was for me." It will be special to know that you stayed with us until the end. Enjoy and subscribe to the channel. We always bring stories like this, real, exciting, and that make us reflect on what really matters. And if you felt this connection now, imagine what still lies ahead, and leave your like. Not because you have to let it, but because it shows that it is worth continuing to tell stories that make us stop for a moment and feel. There is a video here on the side that tells a similar story, beautiful and full of meaning. Click and stay with me there. You will be moved.